Welcome to Model 4.3. In this model, we propose to dedicate some time to learn more about the procurement procedures. We will start with the procurement of the public charging infrastructure. In the second part, our colleagues from UITP will provide a comprehensive overview of how to procure public transport. We will finish this model by looking at how corporate and freight fleets are being procured. Meeting future demands for charging infrastructure will be only possible if we consider all three levels: public, private, and semi-public. Only combining those three will give us the possibility to move towards a zero-emission situation. As we could see from the example of the city of Antwerp, discussed in 4.2, public authorities prefer greater rollout of the private infrastructure over the public. This allows to save high costs and reduce the efforts that have to be put in the procurement and maintenance procedures. Which kind of infrastructure dominates, private or public, depends on the country or regional situation, on the density of the population and the wealth of the citizens. In reality, and independently of the country, public authorities have little to no choice but to start the procedures of the rollout, at least in the early stages, when the market is immature and it is less interesting for the private sector to invest in the rollout. In the next slides, we will talk in detail about the main procurement procedures and requirements for the public charging infrastructure. Procurement procedures can be centralized as well as decentralized, but in reality it is often applied in combination. Which authority holds the responsibility for the rollout depends on the nature of the country. We see that a centralized approach is likely to be used in the smaller states, for example Malta. However, this is not always the case. Another interesting and, in our opinion, highly effective strategy is to engage in joint procurement. In the previous model, we have talked about the fact that travels are often not bound by the geographical borders. Joint procurement solved the potential problem that can be caused by the different strategies applied in different regions or cities by having the same procedure across different regions. You'll be already familiar with Peter from MRA-E talking about the interregional long-term rollout strategies. Let's hear from him again about the joint procurement they have developed in the Netherlands.
So what are the main advantages in choosing for joint procurement? So joint procurement is essential in achieving the required scale and coordination for a public charging network. We make sure relevant developments in technology such as smart charging, but also laws or the market composition get a place in new contracts. Another advantage is that since it takes a long time to have a charge station installed, by bundling our experience and capacity, we can keep speeding up this process. This already allows us to install 200 charge points every month. A third advantage is that the different large procurement initiatives, together with this regional support from municipalities, hands-on support, have created a competitive market. Through economies of scale and standardization, we have now reached a situation in the region where we can have public charging stations installed without public investments, and this has been a recent major breakthrough in our project. So what are the main bottlenecks in joint procurement? Joint procurement requires a lot of coordination and preparation. Finding out what all these different municipalities find most important takes time, and then you also have to create a joint perspective, of course. Having gone through many iterations, we now have a solid base of common principles. An important example I haven't mentioned before is interoperability. We all believe that being able to charge any electric car without any subscription should be the standard on our charging stations. But as new developments keep coming up, we need to keep a balance between supporting and learning from local, perhaps disruptive initiatives and trying to get a regional, consistent approach. An example are the vehicle-to-grid developments. We might all believe that in the future it can be valuable, but the exact technology, for instance AC or DC, that will be best for us is not known yet. And also at what pace we should implement this in our larger procurements is also undecided yet. We have to find it out together. Secondly, I should also mention that joint procurement inevitably leads to larger contracts, and it's hard for local companies and local and smaller companies to get these larger contracts. And we try to counter this by also doing smaller innovative projects and which we can do together with these local partners. I think I should also stress here that having a joint procurement is not where it ends. After procurement, there's still a lot of work to be done. The most difficult task is getting all those stations installed. Municipalities and business can greatly benefit from regional hands-on support in that. What have been the biggest achievements so far? So in 2012, when we started the project, it was very small, maybe 3 or 4 people, and we were more or less tolerated. Right now, electromobility and the value of regional cooperation is broadly acknowledged. Since 2020, the national government supports the launch of 5 similar specialized regional organizations covering the whole of the country. Looking at the numbers, we've had over 6,500 charge points installed, and each single one of them has had a lot of different stakeholders and interests involved. This requires careful attention in terms of finding the appropriate spot, licenses, etc. And in the end, you could say that the reliability people now have in getting their cards charged at a fair price is the major achievement. The charging stations have also been operated by different CPOs and throughout their lifetime, and we can now procure charging infrastructure without public investments. Together, I think this proves that a healthy market has developed, but within a framework that safeguards the end user and public goals. What are the plans for the future? So, as project manager infrastructure within the team, I'm focusing on charging infrastructure here. There are still many subjects where aren't satisfied yet, but let's go into charging infrastructure. First of all, we need to speed up installations. So to do that, we have now started up 2 new instruments. So we predict where there will be demand for expanding the network using the data that is generated by existing charging stations. This will speed up our preparations. We can, for instance, get licenses even before a request from a citizen is received. And also, we're making large-scale maps for every municipality, and where we put or at least plan charging stations for the future. Another initiative I want to mention is the National Data Hub we're getting started up. Together with the major cities in the Netherlands, we believe that the current data or information on where charging stations are, whether they're available, what the price will be, is insufficient. It's inaccurate, it's outdated. And by getting this information right from the source and making it available free of charge and open to all, we hope we can improve that. So, and as said earlier, of course, we also want to support other electric modes of transport other than the privately owned car. Our new plans for fast charging infrastructure and also for private charging infrastructure will really help that, because these locations and solutions are more suitable for the other modes of transport, such as delivery vans or shared cars. So clearly there is still plenty of work to be done, and we remain dedicated to doing our small part in achieving clean air and fighting climate change. So thank you for listening.
Who owns and who develops public charging infrastructure is the first question that we have to answer when talking about procurement. Possible candidates are public authorities, private companies, or the users themselves. In reality, it is very often the combination of 2 or all 3 categories. Let us also not forget that the rollout is a dynamic process, and depending on the maturity of the charging infrastructure, the situation can and should be regularly reassessed and adapted. Before deciding who is the right candidate, the public authorities should start with formulating the objectives, assess the risks, as well as perform the cost-benefit analysis, which should help to make the right decision. Here is an overview of the most commonly used models according to the Sustainable Transport Forum Recommendation Report, but this list is not exhaustive. License model. Under this contract, a party that complies with the policy rules drawn up by a municipality can be given permission to erect, manage, and operate charging points in the public space and enjoy relative flexibility. Concession model. In the concession model, a private party is giving the concession to run and exploit, and in some cases build a certain work or service. The risks, also financial risks, lie with the concessionaire. In contrast to the licensing model, this and other models allow the public authorities to make more demands on where and what kind of infrastructure will be rolled out. Public contracting model. The public authority keeps control of the infrastructure and retains most of the project risks, and from construction to exploitation. The public authority finances the expenditure, both capital and maintenance, and collects the revenues from the consumer. Although this is not written in stone, in most cases, public authorities take the lead in the initial stages, where the degree of maturity of the infrastructure is low, and because there is a lack of private investment, but will gradually reduce their involvement once the business case is more attractive for the private companies. This will also impact the procurement models the public authorities will use. When choosing an approach, public authorities should look into which policy, instrument, and contractual models encourage the development of a competitive market of charging infrastructure and services. Combination of instruments and contracts can also be used for this purpose, ensuring sufficient market competition, guarantees a qualitative, innovative, and affordable infrastructure in the long run. It is therefore important that multiple parties have access to the market. This can be achieved with measures such as limiting contract terms, investigating whether existing long or perpetual concessions can be broken up, splitting up one larger area in various zones, and ensuring that tenders are set up in such a way that new parties also get the chance to compete. When developing procurement procedures, it is important to ensure that tender specifications are as complete as possible. Public authorities should avoid that tender specifications harm the development of the charging infrastructure or the competitiveness of the process. The list of what should be included in the tender specifications is long, but each of the points can contribute to success. Access requirements, such as the accessibility of the charging points at any time of the day or night, and making sure that none of the EV users experiences any sort of discrimination, needs to be guaranteed by the tenderer. Therefore, the specific needs of older persons, persons with reduced mobility, and others ought to be taken into account. Public authorities should ensure that every charging point is served by at least one dedicated parking lot that may only be used by EV users. The charging point should fit with the surrounding in size, safety, positioning, and appearance. The design should be sustainable, robust, modular, and repairable. Tender specifications should include well-described requirements for the capacity of the grid connection, where possible. This way, the installed charging point can be used at full power. Another point is interoperability. Both hardware and software should meet the corresponding standards and protocols. Interoperability and the importance of it in the charging infrastructure has been explained by Flores in Model 4.2. For more information, we also invite you to consult the list of sources that will be provided at the end of the course. Since charging points are made to last a decade or longer, publicly accessible charging points should be ideally compatible with future technologies. This requires not only that they're compatible with the state of the art today, but also that they can be easily configured to future standards when the time comes. That includes higher power levels and more energy-dense batteries and smart recharging, vehicle-to-grid and wireless charging. To offer the best possible services to the EV drivers on one hand and to get the best value for money on the other, public authorities should set minimum uptime requirements, or in other words, time in which the charging point should be operational. Usually it varies between 97 and 99%. Local authorities also need to consider obliging the operator to repair infrastructure within an indicated time frame. The tender specifications should also include support services for the EV users, such as a service number in the language relevant for the area, as well as for foreigners. The installed infrastructure should allow user-friendly ad hoc payment. That means that the user should be able to charge without the need for identification or registering before the use of the charging point. Furthermore, lack of price transparency is often identified as one of the obstacles to the uptake of e-mobility. Making sure that the user gets a clear overview of what she or he is paying for and charging only fair and reasonable prices is crucial. Users should be able to easily compare to other tariffs as well. The public authorities can request the operator to only use renewable energy sources to charge the vehicles. Public authorities should specify how the data gathered from the charging points will be handled. Having data collected from the charging points can provide valuable information, and public authorities should consider including the requirement that the gathered data is made available at their disposal. Since charging infrastructure can be categorized as essential and critical, tender specifications should also include the requirements for cybersecurity. Next on the list is control and enforcement. Public authorities should be able to exercise control and enforcement mechanisms in case the operator doesn't do its work properly. Therefore, the enforcement mechanisms such as penalties should be reflected in their tender specifications. Last but not least, tender specifications should include rules on who owns and is responsible for the infrastructure after the contract terminates. We can't stress enough how important the correct handover can be. Not foreseeing it in the tender specifications can lead to painful examples of when the existing charging infrastructure has to be disassembled after the finalization of the contract. A new infrastructure needs to be erected. This was a concise overview of how to procure the public charging infrastructure. For more information, have a look at the additional sources. See you next time.
Hello, welcome to this e-learning module on e-bus procurement. And thank you to SOLUTIONSplus for giving the opportunity to share this presentation with you. My name is Arno Kerkhoff. I'm head of the bus transport unit of UITP, the International Association of Public Transport and partner of SOLUTIONSplus. About e-bus procurement, what I would like to present to you today is actually, on the one hand, some methodological knowledge on e-bus procurement that we have been building up in the UITP, and also based on, I would say, direct insight that we got from the public transport sector through our members and through our different projects. And eventually I would like to finalize this presentation with some examples to illustrate also the more theoretical part of the procurement. As a first section of today, I would like to tell you a few words about the deployment of e-bus systems, what we call the four-step approach. It's an approach that we have developed in UITP gradually to better, I would say, understand, but also to better present the different stages where project stakeholders are going through, need to go through, when they start thinking of e-bus systems deployment in the city. So you see here on the illustration 4 steps, if, when, what, how. So each step corresponding actually to a question that you might raise as stakeholder. And yeah, I would like to stress out particularly the what phase in this process, being specifically targeted on the selection and the procurement phase of buses. But maybe yeah, to start with first important point to I would like to start with, that is what we yeah, used to call the paradigm shift in public transport procurement. I mean, we used to procure buses at regular stages for fleet renewal in the past, whereby we used to renew year by year, I would say, the existing fleet by new buses, where you had simply to, let's say, prepare tender specifications for the new buses. But we have seen now in the era of electrification that this let's say vehicle procurement has completely changed into a complete e-bus system procurement, where we also need to think in advance on how to handle the charging infrastructure, how to handle the battery component in the e-bus, and eventually also the entire e-bus system implementation in its city environment. For the key actors that are involved traditionally in bus procurement, we used to work with the triangle between PTO, PTA, and the manufacturer, but also this, I would say, stakeholders diagram has been enlarged to new stakeholders. And we have to think here about other local authorities. If the city authority is not necessarily the PTA, like smaller towns or communes, but also like stakeholders on the energy supplier side, eventually the grid side, and also in the industry chain, the supplier of technology and especially the charging infrastructure. Another point already at a fairly early stage that needs high attention in any e-bus system project is of course the cost issue, and we see that more and more the concept of total cost of ownership is governing the design and the management of procurement processes for e-buses. This has been on one hand due to the investment costs, the capex, which is obviously much higher for electric buses, and which needs to take into account at the early calculations. It is the e-bus itself, it are the batteries, but also the additional investment for the charging equipment in the depot or in the city, and the lower energy costs often mentioned for the operations is of course something to take into account as well for the operations OPEX side of the TCO. adaptation costs of the depot punctually where necessary, and most important, I would say here, is in the operations concept of the buses. When there are more buses needed as compared to the previous benchmark situation with diesel buses, and of course when more buses are needed, also more staff to drive them and to maintain them. So these are elements extremely important on which we will get back later when I will say a few words about the request for quotation and the evaluation. But before we get there, I would like also to stress here some information that we have gathered around the different models that we observed in the public transport business when it comes to e-bus procurement, and maybe some additional words on the different players in place. So for maybe to start with the latter, let's say the stakeholders that are involved in e-bus projects are numerous, and the stakeholders grid, so to say, is extremely important to get this clear for your project in your own local situation, and this comprises the city administration, who often are also setting the targets, who are setting the transport strategy, and who give eventually also value of the positive benefits of introduction of e-buses, where we have to think, of course, of clean air, but also of lesser noise in and around the bus routes. Another important player in this stakeholders matrix are the public transport authorities, as they are often the entities who launch the issue for tenders, and also the stakeholder that increase the passenger volume and the customer satisfaction. Third place I want to mention here as important stakeholder, the grid owners and also the energy utility companies that might be requested to get involved, as those companies, they provide in the end also the access to the electric infrastructure and to the electric grid, and who are needed also for a stable power supply in the long term of the project. And last but not least, of course, the bus operators, who are in the value chain, the entity that in the end purchase the buses. They operate also the electric bus fleets, and they are also the partner who value the reliability and the low cost and low complexity of the e-bus project. Other thing important here to keep in mind at early stage are, let's say, the mapping of the roles and responsibilities of each of those stakeholders. We cannot give here a general rule that fits all, but it's of course extremely context depending, and therefore it's important for your own e-bus project to, I would say, to analyze for each stakeholder identified how the responsibilities are distributed, and also which entity is in the best position in the entire project value chain to pick up which responsibility. I want to pick out here one specific point, here number 3, for the bus manufacturers and the so-called availability warranties. It's an important point in the procurement, where of course it is needed by bus operator or the PTA to have strong warranties, but where we have to keep in mind that if bus availability warranties are wanted to put into the contract, of course there should also be space in the project design for the bus manufacturers or the industry to be involved and to share a responsibility in the vehicle charging infrastructure and maintenance and repairs of the charging equipment. However, responsibility for some specific risks, and here we have to think about risks linked to civil engineering works related to the power supply locally. They should be taken always by the PTO or PTA, as they cannot be subcontracted in the project. Here we like to share with you a diagram actually that we worked on with some of the UITP's members from the bus operators, which gives you a sort of step-by-step approach, like on bus line, on the development of bus operations and the different steps that are needed in the project to address and to get answers for. We start here with the zero emission ambition, of course, of the city or of the PTA on the very left side. And then we go to the first stop, which is on the bus types and the bus features. So this needs to be clear from the outset what is wanted in the first place, what kind of zero emission technology. Of course, we are here focusing on battery electric buses, but even at a very early stage, you might imagine that you would like to compare or maybe also to investigate if other zero emission propulsion technologies should be compared or analyzed. Part of the features are also the type of batteries, the type of battery chemistries, and the level of power, energy power that you are thinking of for the bus. This is fairly linked to the vehicle as such. Then we go to the second stop, which is all around the timetable. Again, very local issue, your local bus network. And we see here that the deployment for e-buses is extremely sensitive to the type of bus line and the typology of the bus line environment. So here you have to think of the number of bus stops that are considered, the average commercial speed on the bus line, and eventually the bus distances between the bus stop. But as important is, of course, when buses need to be reliable in operations, to have sufficient buffer times at the end of the bus stop. So this time also needs to be taken into account when thinking about the timetable, and especially the timetable for e-buses. Next stop on the design diagram are all the environmental factors, which are always very local factors. You have to think here about specific climate situation in your city, in your country or continent, and of course also the topography of the bus lines is part of this environmental analysis for bus operations. Once all those elements are being dealt with, we go to the next bus stop on the charging strategy. So here it is important to make a combination with the previous input data and to start, I would say, building a concept where the charging time can be integrated, as well as the type of charging methodologies, either on the depot or let's say fast charging on the bus line, or maybe a combination of both methodologies, which would in the end up in a specific charging strategy, after which the next bus stop we can go to the infrastructure requirements, where also the I would say the charging facilities can be designed and precised, as well as the capacity of the available electricity on the grid. After the next point in this diagram, we go to the need for the drivers. Of course, it is important that the entire concept could be operated with the e-buses and with the drivers. So we need here to make a certain number of iterations and simulations on the driver's need, and this would then altogether result in a certain number of financial consequences. So I would say this is on the more on the conceptual level, the diagram we work with, and you could imagine that with the scale of any e-bus project, this is a loop that needs to be reiterated at various rounds to come to a good and stable result. So, and to go on, I would say we are talking about bus procurement. So we go to the launch of request for quotation, which is a very important step where in the end in the project there is this need to reach out to the market place, which is also always a local marketplace. So it's important to get an idea, at least, what is the maturity of the market in your country, in your geographical area, and then we can say with respect to the given specifications, the bidder would have to supply, I would say, regarding to the buses, the rather classical technical requirements that always come with the buses, including the vehicle purchase price for different quantities, for different fleet sizes, guaranteed buyback for the price after a preset period, often related to the kilometer load, and the aspect of the maintenance and repair costs related to the kilometer load, commercial speed, and the topography of the routes. So I would say this is quite traditional, classical requirement what we put in specifications for the tender. If we talk about electric buses, I would say on top of maybe the diesel specifications, these are characteristic elements that are coming in addition, amongst which the capacity of the battery pack in kilowatt hours, but also the type of battery technology. If you are rather specifying the FP or NMC type of batteries, or other chemistries for batteries, as well as the maximum charging speed expressed in C, in case you are specifying on fast charging e-bus schemes. Other very important specification are around the air conditioning capacity, also expressed in kilowatt hour, and also the heating technology, specifically important for cold environments or winters. Is there a heat pump or a diesel heater to be specified, or will everything be heated with electrical energy, in which case this is important, of course, demands on the capacity of the batteries, as well as the consumption of the electricity. The total number of passengers in relation with the requested seating capacity, very important specification for e-buses, specifically for the load of the batteries, where it is important that there is sufficient capacity remaining for transporting people. And here, last but not least, for the OPEX, as shown before, very important, I would say, cost variable for the operator to have the energy consumption of the e-buses in control, and this can be specified at best when buses are procured, so in this tender phase, and we can recommend specifically the UITP e-sort values, which allow the comparison of energy consumption of the different bus brands. With respect to the batteries, it is very important to write good specifications for the battery conditions, including or excluding in the bus price, and this is something we observe more and more, based on a kilometer price, where the batteries are, let's say, requested in the bid to be offered on a leasing basis. Another important aspect are concerning the warranties on batteries and the warranty conditions. Of course, the warranties can only be requested in the market if the conditions under which this warranty is requested are also expressed in the tender specifications. And here we have to think about very technical Are we talking about half C, 1C, or maybe 2C charging speeds? The depth of discharging, how often do we balance the battery cells overnight, etc. So these are all very important technical parameters that intervene in the conditions for warranty requests. Another very important component, again, for this part of the tender book are the specifications on the charging infrastructure. First of all, the number of chargers that are needed, and also think about the availability of such chargers when there might be need for maintenance or incident. So the backup of chargers in the network. Unit price and the total charger costs, meaning the complete, I would say, integration and connection to the grid of each unit, and the needed grid capacity for the entire eBus project, depending on kilometers, commercial speed, and the topography of the bus routes. What we also have seen from different examples is specifically when it comes to eBus schemes that use opportunity charging, so fast charging electric buses, is that the Public Transport Authority needs to indicate in the tender the spatial locations where this could be possible, and also the permits to install the infrastructure and the permits to make the connection to this electric grid needs to be included in a tender to make it compliant with the market, the local market needs. Other elements to be addressed to improve the tender conditions are here sum up. You see a few examples. Who will be the owner of the charger equipment? Who will be the owner of the locations where the infrastructure will be installed? And how the transfer towards the next contract or operator will be arranged in case of a competitive tender for public transport services. Also important point of attention here in the tender book are the length of the tendering period across different projects, and also examples from members. We have seen that 1 year, let's say, period is likely as a minimum to be required between the publication of the tender and possible start of the eBus operations in commercial service on the other hand. Last but not least, I would like to sum up and to conclude with giving you also some more concrete examples how these, let's say, more theoretic or modeled considerations could be met in practice. First example I can show here is from South America in Santiago, where since 2020 impressive eBus project has been put in place by the city, and where today, 2021, it is meant to be already the largest or one of the larger eBus fleet operations outside China. According to our latest information, some 776 e-buses are operating in Santiago. It's an example extremely interesting to highlight for innovative financing models, because I would say the buses in Chile were procured by all by private actors, by the PTOs, but also specifically by the utility companies and other financial services and OEMs, and with payment guarantees that were provided by the local PTA, in this case DTPM, backed by the Ministry of Transport, as part of contract extensions with the PTO. So a very strong, as a proactive role of the private actors to be able to provide financing abilities for this project. The PTOs were able to extend the existing contracts, and the lease payments for the e-buses and charging infrastructure were then discounted from their regular payments and paid directly by their financing partner. And important also to mention, it's not always possible in all legislations in all countries around the world, but it was the case here in Chile that these procurements were organized in a non-competitive way, whereas usually competitive tenders are the norm for bus procurement also in Santiago. Another example to illustrate the models are from Europe. Here it's the e-bus scheme in Eindhoven in the Netherlands, where from 2016 43 e-buses have been introduced, and where, let's say, the long-term 2024 perspective is to scale up further to 203 electric buses. So you have here some technical, I would say, details on the electric lines, 8 in number. With the technology here are, let's say, roof-mounted pantographs on the depot with, let's say, medium battery capacity and articulated buses with 136 passengers. Interesting is also the operational concept as stretched before in the point on the CAPEX versus OPEX, specifically the operating costs here with additional buses needed for technical reserve 3 and 6 additional e-buses for the charging concept. So you see from the 43 e-buses in the fleet, 36 are run for transport needs, I would say, at peak hours, 3 buses for, I would say, normal technical reserve, and 6 additional buses to comply with the charging scheme, which is, of course, very important in the TCO calculation, as stressed before. Then to conclude, I would like to share these final recommendations with you. On the one hand, procurement of e-bus systems need to consider all the aspects relative to the introduction of innovation, not only technical innovation, but also contractual innovation, and specifically dependent on, let's say, the stakeholders that are involved in the e-bus project. We also recommend specifically locally the development of partnerships with the industry, the bus industry, the technology industry, but also the procuring entity, the regulators, the financial institutions, and the energy suppliers to ensure a coordinated action for the e-bus project. Third point to recommend here very strongly is to define as part of the e-bus project a fair and suitable risk-sharing scheme between, on the one hand, the fleet owners of the e-buses and the other stakeholders in the project according to their roles and competences. And integration of innovation and technology aspects into the tenders is something that should be really thought of in advance, like durations versus investment, the risk sharing, depreciation times, and also the reselling value of the rolling stock. So consider the amortization of the investment versus contract duration. It might be sometimes needed to, for instance, put in the market extensions of contract durations, which might be very attractive for the market, for the bidders to come with proposals, and clear specifications with suitable indicators and acceptance procedures, like the ones on guidance on UNDP e-sort, is highly recommended, also to streamline the market for the best, getting the best proposals for your bid. And last but not least, facilitation of infrastructure deployment processes like the depot, e-bus depot upgrade and the civil works is very important to integrate this as well in your eBus project. So in a nutshell, we went from let's say the 4 steps approach and the focus on the procurement of eBuses through the different let's say points of attention and the different models to some illustrations and final recommendations. I hope this gave you a very broad and first insight in this very important step for eBus procurement, and we hope to be back to you at another e-learning module for other aspects of the eBus deployment projects. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Simon Clement and I'm working for ICLE's Sustainable Economy and Procurement team. Between 2016 and 2019, I was coordinating the ByZ project. ByZ was focused on exploring zero-emission deliveries of goods and services through smart procurement, and that's what I would like to talk to you about today. Now, when we think about the link between public procurement and transportation in a city, i.e. the movement of goods and people around the city, we might well think about vehicles that are owned by the public authority, the fleet vehicles, which carry out the service the public authority provides. Perhaps we will also think about the transportation services provided by the city, public transportation, for example, social transportation, other forms of transportation services. What we might not think of in the same way are the huge numbers of other services that public authorities purchase each year, which also lead to a lot of trips around the city. For example, waste collection services, but also others slightly less obvious, such as cleaning services, catering services, locksmith and maintenance services, street cleaning services, for example, all of which involve a number of vehicle trips around the city to deliver staff to their place of work and to deliver the goods that they need to carry out those services. Public authorities also purchase a large range of different goods to carry out their operations, and of course those goods need to be delivered to the public premises. Construction works. One of the biggest contributors to urban transportation, urban traffic in many places are construction vehicles traveling around the city, delivering construction workers, but also of course delivering construction materials. And finally, there are a range of other types of procurement activities which do not involve much transportation, but this is the very small minority of procurement actions. So what we can see is procurement, public procurement as a whole, has a very large impact on the different types of transport happening within a city. In Copenhagen, for example, the procurement of non-transport related goods and services, so this excludes public transport services, it excludes the waste collection services. Still, that procurement alone leads to an estimated 8.3 million vehicle kilometers per year within the city boundaries, leading to emissions of around 7,500 tons of CO2 emissions. In Oslo, waste collection just from large facilities, so excluding private household waste collection, on its own leads to 700 tons of CO2 emissions per year just from transport within the city boundaries. And in Rotterdam, deliveries of sand on their own lead to 300,000 vehicle kilometers being traveled per year within the city. This was the starting point for the ByZ project, to look at how we can encourage innovative solutions for the delivery of these types of goods and services through the procurement processes that we have. This involved 3 core cities, Rotterdam, Oslo and Copenhagen, together with a group of other observer cities from around Europe, and as mentioned, ran from 2016 to 2019. And you can find more information about the project on the website here on the screen. What we did within ByZ was follow a very specific procurement process to try to develop innovative procurement approaches for the delivery of goods and services. And this process is outlined in the handbook that's appearing on the screen now that you can find on the link below. So just very quickly to take you through what we did within the project. First of all, we mapped the transportation footprint of procurement in each of the cities. That meant we looked at all the different types of procurement activities and we calculated through a series of estimations what the precise transportation to deliver that goods or services to the city was. So that way we could identify which were the real big culprits in terms of vehicle emissions from procurement in the city. That led us on to step 2, to prioritize which procurement sectors we would then look at within the project. And this, of course, related to the size of the transportation footprint of that particular sector. But there were other issues related to that as well, political priorities, market readiness, for example, that led us to prioritize certain sectors. Then a very important sector, and one that is far too often overlooked within procurement processes, we engaged with the market. What we did for these priority sectors is we went out to speak to different potential suppliers, existing suppliers, those who might be interested in supplying, right down the supply chain, to see what types of innovative solutions could be developed that would lead to the zero emission delivery of some of these goods and services. And this was both with market actors, but also internal stakeholders. So within public authorities, many of these goods and services involve multiple internal actors. And we involved them within that engagement process as well. And on the basis of these market engagement processes, we then prepared for each city innovative procurement plans for the specific goods and services which were being investigated. And once again, you can find detail about that within the handbook here and on the website more generally, but I would like to then quickly go through some of the types of ideas and conclusions which we came out with in ByZ. So first of all, if we're looking specifically at services, as mentioned, this could be a wide range of different types of services, cleaning services, catering services, maintenance services, etc. What are some of the solutions? What are some of the pathways to achieving zero emission delivery of those services? Well, the first is using award criteria, giving preference for the use of zero emission vehicles in delivering the contracts. And this is also possible, something you can do during the length of the contract. If you feel the market is not perhaps ready to operate already with zero emission vehicles, you can say by the end of the contract, we would like a certain proportion of your service to be delivered using zero emission vehicles, and make that part of the competitive tendering process. Another possibility is to use sustainable fleet certification. There are a number of fleet certificates which provide evidence of the sustainable nature of the vehicles and the way in which fleets are run. And that can be used within tendering processes to provide either award criteria for a fleet having a certification, or to make it as part of the contract that by the end of the service, the fleet should have a certification. Monitoring of data, transportation data, is something that we discovered is not routinely done for public contracts. Making that part of the contract itself is a good way to collect information about what impact your service is having, so you can lead to improvements in the future. So including that as part of contracts is also a good idea. Splitting tenders up into specific geographical lots is a good way of minimizing transport across the city. So trying to make sure that the trips happen within a smaller area of the city rather than across the whole length of the city. Of course, using specifications to insist that either some of the vehicles are zero emissions or potentially all by the end of the contract, and also weeding out more heavily polluting vehicles as well. Potentially awarding the use of non-motorized transport in the provision of services, using cycling, walking, or public transport. It might not be an obvious thing for service delivery, but this is being trialed in several cities, and it is being trialed successfully. Increasing contract length. This was mentioned by many of the suppliers in the market engagement services we had, to say that if you give us a longer contract, it's easier for us to invest in what are initially more expensive zero emission vehicles. Asking for service providers to give you a sustainable mobility concept, and having someone able to judge that, potentially also from the outside. Providing on-site charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, but also potentially storage space for equipment to allow, for example, people to travel to work by bike, by walking. What we also learned from many of the suppliers was they would very much welcome having some guidance on the purchase of vehicles themselves. And so this is something that public authorities themselves could also provide. Moving across to delivery of goods. Again, several of the same approaches can be made when asking for goods. You can set award criteria to require that, or to ask for zero emission vehicles to be used in delivering those goods to the public sector. What you can also encourage is delivery consolidation. So the establishment of, for example, urban consolidation centers where goods get delivered to one spot, and from that one spot they can then be delivered to the different sites, for example, using zero emission last mile delivery. And the use of a consolidation center, either a public or a private one, can be made part of the contracting process. It's also possible to establish virtual demand consolidation platforms to allow buyers to group their demand and hopefully therefore lead to fewer delivery trips. Construction delivery. Now here, several cities are looking at developing construction logistics plans or asking their contractors to provide construction logistics plans as part of the tendering process so that they focus themselves on how they can minimize the transportation disruption caused by their works. What you can also do is set minimum vehicle requirements for the vehicles being used to deliver goods and people on and off site, as well as award criteria for zero emission vehicles. And again, the use of construction consolidation centers is something which many public authorities are starting to look at. For more information about the project, as mentioned, you can look at BIZET, you can look at the individual innovative procurement plans that have been developed by each of the cities, and you can find the handbook which I introduced earlier on. So thank you very much for listening to me today, and I hope to hear from some of you. Bye-bye.
And now we are moving virtually to Oslo to learn about best practices on electric mobility requirements in procurements with Geir. Good morning, Geir.
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you. My name is Geir Rossebø. I work in the city of Oslo as a sustainable manager for mobility in the central procurement unit. And we've been working with e-mobility in procurements for several years now.
Mm-hmm. And how does the city manage the procurement of maintenance and repair services for public facilities, especially their e-fleets?
Yes, we have a goal for transport in procurement that says that in 2025, all transport in our tenders or in our contracts are to be zero emission or biogas in 2025. And also hopes for repair service contracts. So we use a standardized procedure for all our tenders. From now until 2025, we use either award criteria or minimum requirements in our tender documents. And we see that this gives us really good results. So this method has been developed during past years through the BIZET project. And we hope that we can still develop these models and that we will reach out in 2025. And we also have, for our own vehicle fleet, we have a goal that all the municipality vehicles are going to be 100% zero emission soon. And we're now introducing a new procurement procedure for our own vehicles. That will be a dynamic purchase system where we'll start buying vehicles in April, May this year. So for small vehicles, we have a share of over 72% zero emission. For the larger vehicles, we have a good share of biogas vehicles, but we hope to see more zero emission vehicles for a large one soon.
Thank you. That's super interesting. So could you tell us more about how Oslo involved their suppliers, large and small, in a market dialogue that proved essential to define an inclusive procurement process while maintaining high environment standards, and how this all worked in practice?
Yes, for us it's really important that we include SMEs in our procurements, and we try to reach out to both large companies and the small ones. And in our unit, we have an annual dialogue conference for the citywide framework agreements. That's our contracts that all the agencies in the municipality are purchasing from. So on this conference, we bring up all the sustainability topics which we find relevant in the procurements, and we ask them how they can meet our requirements. And transport is also a big part of that, and gives them time and predictability to meet our requirements, like the 2025 target that we have. And we also have the market dialogue with the suppliers upfront each procurement process, and we ask them if they are able to deliver zero emission solutions now, and if three or more suppliers say that they can do it from the contract start, we'll use a minimum requirement. If not, we will use award criteria. And also for knowing how we the suppliers are working with this topic, we also use our regular contract follow-up meetings to see if they are on track with their transition to zero emission, and what kind of problems or challenges they have when using these vehicles for us. And I believe that it's important also to engage with all the stakeholders, not only suppliers, but we also need to know larger transport companies, logistics companies, and other stakeholders as well. So we have a network in Oslo called the Business for Climate, which is open for all companies that share our goals in cutting emissions, and we have several meetings every year where we discuss many topics in how to cut emissions, and transport is a large part of it. And it's an open network, and they can bring their ideas and on how we can use procurements to use procurements to cut emissions.
That sounds great. And can you tell us more about what are your biggest achievements and lessons learned so far?
Yeah, I think that the largest, the biggest surprise for us was that the transition to zero emission vehicles went much faster than we expected. And that's two aspects of that, or maybe two answers to why it was so successful. One is that new models or vehicles has been introduced in the past year. So there's been many companies now looking into it, and and when we award them in our procurements, they have an incentive to buy them. But also that we have national measures that promote zero emission vehicles, like toll. They don't have to pay toll roads, and they have free parking and lower cost when buying them. So these are a part of it as well. But we also see that in our procurements now, we have standardized the methods that we're using, and that also creates a predictability for our suppliers, so they know what we expect and or which technologies they need to invest in. So I think now this model we have gone for, we have been using past years, has been really successful, and we see that in almost every new contract we sign, especially for our own contracts, the citywide framework agreements. Our suppliers now, almost every contract now, they will do all the last mile deliveries with electric vehicles, which we are really proud of that we have achieved.
Congratulations. And to ask a tough question as well, are there any limitations or challenges?
Yeah, we see that there are still a few large vehicles available, meaning that when we need goods deliveries where that requires larger trucks, they still has to be done with biofuels or biogas. So we don't have so many, our suppliers don't have so many options yet. But there are vehicles now introduced into the market, and some of our suppliers have bought them, but it's still a few vehicles. So we're waiting for all the producers or original equipment manufacturers that they will deliver all the vehicles we need so it can be 100% zero emission. And we also see that parking in city center of Oslo is limited, and also there's a need for a fast charging infrastructure. So these are some challenges that we see, and hopefully they will be solved in the upcoming years. But we also since we're talking about facility services before, and we see that some of our the one delivering craftsman services like electricians and plumbers and so on, they will bring their vans to the home when their shift ended. And many of them live in apartments, and they don't own their own parking space. So they have to rely on public charging stations if they have an electric vehicle. And we see that in some of the areas outside Oslo that EV charging stations is not fully developed. So for the moment, that also is a problem for us because they don't have a place to park the car and charge it overnight.
It's very inspiring, the case of Oslo, and I'm wondering if what are your plans for the future?
Yes, for our environmental criteria that we're using in our procurements, we always develop the ones we have and try to make it better all the time. So, but for new areas that we're looking into are one of them is the second last mile, because now we're just only looking into last mile delivery and deliveries to our addresses or buildings in Oslo. So we just have the first part of the deliveries. So we want to see if we can use our procurement to also award suppliers that have second part or the next part of the transport. Also use if they also use zero emission technologies. That's an interesting part, and we like to do some piloting on this in time to come. Another part we're looking into is route optimization, or how we can decrease the number of vehicles in Oslo. So we believe that if we can do especially goods transportation, if we can do that smarter, we can both reduce the number of vehicles, and I think it will also be easier to introduce more EV vehicles, because then we'll face all the problems with access to charging infrastructure. These are two areas that we are looking into. Or on a city level, we're also looking on zero emission zones. It's being planned in the city center of Oslo. And that's something we also need to address in our procurements, and how our suppliers are going to deliver to our buildings that will be located in the zero emission zone. These are interesting things that will come the next few years.
Thank you, Geir. And do you have any final words for this interview, and perhaps an advice for the cities that would like to embark on the same journey?
Yeah, I'll encourage all public buyers to use environmental criteria in the tenders when it comes to transport and other environmental topics as well. It's not hard to do. We have experience, and we have also some guidance in English that we have produced, so we can look into that. And I think that starting with maybe a few contracts and have a dialogue with the market, and they can give you some feedback on if this is feasible or not. So I think the most important thing is not to be afraid of using environmental requirements in procurements. So just jump into it.
And with this note of jumping into it and test it and scale it up, then I would like to thank you for this interview, Geir.
You're welcome. Have a nice day.
This part of SOLUTIONSplus E-course is about company fleets, about passenger cars and about vans. The world is battling climate change for a number of years and is looking for clean mobility. Therefore, the number of battery electric vehicles sold is increasing. We can see on this slide that the total fleet of battery electric vehicles is increasing in the Netherlands, Norway, France and Germany. Despite this, company cars still make up 96% of the total company car sales in Europe. This was in 2019. Therefore, there is a lot to gain in the battle against climate change amongst company cars. There are a couple of reasons why this is interesting, and the high percentage of petrol and diesel cars being sold is the first one. The second one is that company cars travel more than twice as many kilometers per year as privately owned cars. Therefore, every year they emit a lot of CO2, and every shift of a company car to a battery electric vehicle saves more CO2 than a privately owned vehicle that shifts to a battery electric vehicle. Purchase prices of battery electric vehicles are usually higher than that of comparable petrol cars. On the other hand, the total cost of ownership is usually lower for battery electric vehicles. In the next couple of minutes, I'd like to zoom in on this and show you exactly the breakdown of the total cost of ownership of battery electric vehicles. First, I'd like to talk about the total cost of ownership. Afterwards, I'll talk about the model availability. First, about the passenger cars. On this slide, you can see our total cost of ownership calculation comparing battery electric vehicles and petrol cars. We've calculated this for Germany, the Netherlands, France and Norway. These calculations are based on a couple of assumptions. The first one is that you own a car for 4 years and that you drive 28,000 kilometers per year. For some people this is a lot of kilometers, but this is based on a company car which usually has a higher utilization per year. On the right hand side you see a breakdown of the total cost of ownership. The TCO, which is the abbreviation of total cost of ownership, is built up of the depreciation, which is higher for battery electric vehicles and therefore a larger cost. After that we have the energy cost. Electricity is usually cheaper than petrol, so therefore a saving for battery electric vehicles. Insurance and maintenance, both are, there's a bit of a discrepancy there, but that's marginal. And there's a large saving again on road tax. This is different per country, but the graph on the right hand side is an average of the 4 research countries, which are Germany, the Netherlands, France and Norway. You can see on the left hand side that Norway has by far the biggest benefit of battery electric vehicles and France the lowest. This is all dependent on local tax systems and incentives, therefore always look at your own situation when calculating the total cost of ownership. Then on to the van total cost of ownership. Here we again compared a battery electric vehicle, but not against a petrol van, but against a diesel van. This is because this example is for the Netherlands specifically, and diesel vans are more common than petrol vans. The breakdown on the right hand side is an average again, but this time, as I mentioned, only for the Netherlands. The depreciation is again the biggest cost for a battery electric van, and the depreciation is much higher than for a diesel van. This is partly because of the high purchase cost, but also because of the high depreciation percentage. On energy cost, there's again a saving, and the other cost, that's again like maintenance and insurance, is a marginal difference. There is a big difference, however, in road tax. A diesel van in the Netherlands pays a high amount of road tax, and a battery electric vehicle is exempted of this tax. You can see on the left hand side in the table that the saving of a battery electric vehicle, battery electric van compared to a diesel van is much smaller than on the previous slide for passenger cars. And this has a lot to do with the model availability, but I'll come to this in a second. Overall, you can see that for passenger cars and for vans, the choice for a battery electric vehicle is financially very solid. Now you've seen a short description of the total cost of ownership. Now on to the model availability. On this slide you can see what I already mentioned briefly earlier, that the model availability of a van is very slim. In 2019 there were only approximately 5 models available. This grew to 7 in 2020, and there will be an increase in 2021, but how many models will become available is not yet to be said with certainty. This does show that there is very little competition in this in the van segment. We believe that in the next coming years this will increase, and this will also improve the ranges and the usability of vans, therefore also making it more interesting. We have already seen that the total cost of ownership already is competitive with a diesel van. The model availability of battery electric passenger cars, however, is very good, has very much increased over the last couple of years. With only 17 models in 2017, this has more than doubled in 4 years to 41 models in 2020. And these are not different battery packages of one model, no, these are all different kinds of models. After this brief e-course on the total cost of ownership and the model availability of battery electric vehicles versus diesel vans and petrol passenger cars, we come to a conclusion. Electrifying company car fleets first is financially beneficial. We see that the total cost of ownership of a battery electric vehicle is much lower than for a petrol passenger car, and it's slightly lower for a battery electric van. Second, there's a wide range of vehicles, especially for passenger cars. We've seen that there is a wide range, a high model availability, but that this is a bit lacking for vans. But we expect this to increase over the next coming years and to improve heavily. Third, there's a reduction of noise and air pollution, obviously. So in the end, I'd like to conclude that a choice for reducing CO2 by choosing a battery electric vehicle is also a financially solid choice.